All right, getting my head out of the Discord. Looks like one of you had trouble with the imports, but let's see now. I hope all of you got pretty far in this, and let's see what we can make sure my mic's working. Yeah, let's walk through this together. So let me share my screen and share my entire screen at my own risk. Yeah, my do not disturb is on. Okay. So I'm going to just tackle this from scratch. I hope all of you were able to kind of follow along with the loose instructions. I'm meant to try to give a little bit of wiggle room as well as try to, challenge you for how you're able to get through this. But let's walk through these steps now. So what we're first going to do is we're going to learn how to dynamically generate those calendar links. The cool thing is it's with a bunch of different popular services. And we're going to walk through first how that even works in the first place. But we're going to then create that button, which we're going to be able to show all the links and finally work on a little bit of the UX from that. So starting off, let me go ahead and clone the repository, or I can run the dgit command from the terminal. Let me pop open my code. So I'm going to run this dgit, which is going to basically just clone it down and set it up with a new project for me. And I run npm install, npm run dev, and it looks like we're in business. So what I ultimately want to do is replace this with my new add to calendar button. Now, to start off, how does this even work? So I'm going to use an example of Google Calendar. Now, what's going to actually happen is if you're familiar with just simply creating a new event, you have all this stuff that you need to fill in, but maybe there's an easier way that we can have that pre-filled. So the cool thing is if I click more options here, this is going to take me to a new page. And if you notice in the URL here, we probably can just get rid of this state. I'm not quite sure what state is doing, but probably something to do with the state of it. But the nice thing about this is it takes in a bunch of URL parameters, which ultimately allows us to pre-fill a lot of these different fields. So if I type in text equals space jelly palooza, I think that's what I've been calling it, we can see that now I have a new calendar event that has space jelly palooza. And if I do, I think it's details, coolest event ever. Let's see if that worked. And I got it right. Yep. So we can see that that also fills out the description. And finally, just as the last example, there's a lot of different fields, but location, for instance, outer space. I'm not clever today, but we can see once I have the location there, it also filled out the location. So ultimately, my goal here is to be able to generate these links on the fly. Now, theoretically, I can just pop this in. Let me open my code. I don't think I ever opened that. And put on a better theme for y'all. What I can, is this the right repo? Oops, this is the solution repo. I'm on the wrong one. What did I do here? What did I do? Did I check out the wrong branch? Sorry about this. Maybe I have another instance of this running. No, this is right because the solution's not in there. Maybe I just opened up the wrong code window. Okay, here we go. I don't know what happened there, but okay, we're good. So theoretically, what I can do is I can paste this link in here, right? And I can templatize this. I can add my title here. And I can fill all these out as dynamic variables, right? But there's a little bit of an easier way. And ultimately, I would have to do that for every single different calendar. I'd also have to make sure that I'm formatting each of those links to the specific different calendar services, because what the parameters look like for Google is going to slightly different for Outlook or Microsoft 365 and those things. So we have a better solution to do this all in one little nice kept up package. So this package is called Calendar Link, and it just makes it really easy to be able to set this up. So if we're looking at some of the examples here, we can import all the different services. We can create a new event object with all the different information that we want, and we can just really easily vend all these different links. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by installing this package. I'm going to then open back up my code editor, and I'm going to then just copy the imports right from npm and make sure to use the import statement, of course. So copy these right in. I'm going to also copy this events object just to make sure I get all those details correct. And let's call this my space jelly Palooza. I think that's what I called it down here. Yep. I can copy this description. The dates, I'm going to just manually do that. So 2024, 07, 14. What is that? 1500. I don't really need to do this in this detail, but we're going with it. And I can just leave the hours as is. But now what I can do is I can take that Google, for instance, and let's console log out Google, and I'll pass in that event object. Now, as you can see, if you're using TypeScript and following along with TypeScript isn't necessarily happy here. But what we can do is we can import this calendar link type here, and I can then make sure I define this event as a calendar link. Or wait, did I do that right? I believe that was calendar. I'm sorry, that's calendar event, not calendar link. Okay, so now we're looking good. We have calendar event as our event. We're passing it into Google. And now let's just log this out and see what it looks like. So I'm going to refresh after I run my development server. And we can see that we now have that similarly looking link. Let me open this up in a new tab. We can see that the API looks a little bit differently because it looks like they're using a different way of templatizing that. It looks like it's a more focused API, but ultimately what it redirects us to is that event edit page where we have all these the same URL parameters filled out, and it was able to easily really create this new page for me with all the information that I wanted about this. Now, the nice thing is, as I was alluding to, is we can do this for all the other different services. So let's try Outlook, for instance, or Yahoo. If we again refresh the page, we now have our Outlook, which is going to open up the same templatized page. We're going to open up our Yahoo, which again opens up the same template with all the information that we want. So we're in business, right? Like, this is a really great way. Honestly, you can just add a bunch of text links if you really want, but I think it looks a little bit nicer, a little bit better user experience, and just a little bit cleaner of a look to have a specific add to calendar button. So how do we actually add the button itself? So I'm going to use Tailwind to do this. I'm going to start off by making this just a div. It probably could be a paragraph tag, but I'm going to first add my button. Let's say add to calendar. I'm just going to add some class names on this. Let me break this down a little bit. Let's call this, I'm blanking, inline block, px4, py3, and we'll look at this in a second. How about border zinc 500. Let's add some, do we want to add some shout out? Sure, let's add some shout out to that. Let's make it rounded as well. Let's see what we got. Okay, so we got a really basic button. Maybe the border can be a little bit lighter there. I'm just nitpicking at this point. What am I doing here? 400. I think that looks a lot better. So now we have this basic button. So what we want to happen is whenever we click this, we want to open up that list of links. So let's now move forward with adding the list itself. So to do that, I'm going to use an unordered list. And for each of these, I'm going to create a list item and ultimately an href, which I'm going to include that information. Let's start off with Google here, where let me grab my Google event. I can now pass that in as the href, and you can really abstract this if you want. Probably the better way to manage this list of links is to create an array at the top here, such as links with all the array, and then have all the different objects and loop out. But just for simplicity, I'm just going to move forward with adding these manually for this walkthrough here. But let's also add the Outlook and the Yahoo for now. So let's add our Outlook, which will be Outlook. And we have finally our Yahoo, and we can add the other ones later after we just get this baseline here. So now that we have that list, we have all the different links. If I click it, open up a new tab, it works. I want to force opening it up in a new tab so that when somebody clicks it, it does it itself. So I'm going to add a target equals blank to that so that when somebody clicks it, even if they don't push the command key or control, if you're on Windows, I believe, it'll still open that up in a new tab since it's supposed to be a more temporary page for them to add this to their calendar. But ultimately, now I want this to look like it's a little floating menu, right? So let's style this a little bit. I'm going to add a class name. Let's see, BG white, shadow large again, rounded. Let's add, what do we want to do? So we want to start to position this relative to the button itself, right? So what I'm going to do is on that wrapping div, let's call this relative itself. And then we can add absolute, We can say top full so that it's coming down the full height of the button, or since the button is ultimately going to be the height now that we're absolutely positioning this. We can say left 0, which I don't think we necessarily need to add, but it'll still help make sure we're kind of keeping this how we want. Let's see where we're at. And I think that's a good start. We need to add a little bit more styling. So let's add some padding. I think I want the padding to be on the links. The reason why you want to add the padding to the links is so that you're giving somebody a bigger click area when they're ultimately clicking on the link itself, rather than just having very tiny links with a huge outside padding of the whole drop-down menu. So let's add some classes to our links here. How about px3, py2, or maybe px4? I can't remember exactly what it was, but we can kind of move along with this, or this can probably just be straight up block. I think that's looking a lot better. And then to avoid making the gaps really large between each of the links, we can narrow that down a hair, and then we can start to add that outside Y padding to the outside element. So we can add py, let's call that 2. And I think that's looking pretty nice and consistent around the actual container, including the links. And did I get them on each of them? Looks like I didn't add the py to the other ones. So that's looking a little bit nicer, maybe a little bit more. Again, I'm just being nitpicky here. And I don't think I updated it. Yep, I didn't update it again for all of them. So I think that's looking a lot better. So it's giving us our Google link, our Yahoo link, and our Outlook link. Now, the ultimate goal here, though, is to open this dynamically by clicking it and opening it. So how can we do that? So probably the most basic way to do this is by using state, React state. So let's start off with that solution, and then we can go to something a little bit more advanced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import use ref from React. Use state from React. And I'm going to say const is open, set is open, and creating a new state instance. Now, if you're following along with TypeScript, I'm going to also type this out as a Boolean. You probably don't necessarily need to, but let's also just add a default value of false because we want to start it off as hidden. I'm going to then take this is open value, and I'm going to wrap the entire thing with it. So let's say if it is open, or rather, I need to wrap the unordered list, we can then see that if it's open, that's going to be the only time that it shows. Now, let's see if that works. I need to also add the onClick handler to the button so that it has a way to trigger that is open value. So let me break this down just so it's a little bit easier to see for all of us. I'm going to add an onClick to the button so that when that fires, I'm going to set is open. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the opposite, or rather, if it's true, it's going to be false. If it's false, it's going to be true of the is open value. That way, it's just a little bit easier. I don't have to add any kind of conditional in there. I'm just simply saying if it is open, I don't want it to be. If it is not open, I want it to be. So let's see what this looks like now. So here, now I don't have that list of links showing anymore. So if I click it though, we can see that very nicely it's showing and hiding depending on the state that I just set. Now, one thing that I like to pay attention to is the details, and this certainly works, but it might be a little bit nicer if it faded in a hair. Nothing drastic. We don't want to put long animations and make people actually have to wait for the UI, but just a hair of a little bit of a fade in can make it feel a little bit better. So how can we do this? Now, the tricky thing is, because this is going to be basically pulling it in and out of the DOM, we're not really able to, at least in an easy way, manage a transition like this. Particularly, we want to look to do this with something like CSS, not adding any kind of complicated JavaScript for this. So we can use a little bit of CSS, but we need to kind of rework how we're actually hiding it, or rather showing it and not showing it. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to remove that wrapping is open. I'm going to now make this class name a templated string. So now what I'm going to do is, inside of this class name, I'm going to create a new a dynamic value here, and I'm going to say if it is open, I want it to be, and let's just start off with the basic. If it is open, I want it to be a block, add a ternary here. Otherwise, I want it to be none, right? So let's just make sure that this works. And I broke something, block none, or hidden rather. There we go. So we can see that now it's still working. and it's just now using CSS to hide it and show it. So that works pretty well. But again, I want to have that transition. Now, the tricky thing is if I just try to do something like opacity 100 and opacity 0, because ultimately opacity is how we're going to transition that, and say transition opacity. If I try to do it just like that, we can see that the transition is not actually working. Now, the issue is the transition of opacity isn't going to be able to work with simply displaying it and hiding it the way that the display property is actually working. So what we actually need to do is use the visibility instead. And what we can do is we can say invisible versus visible. And now we can see that we got that really nice subtle fade in. Again, it's not too long that it's going to make somebody have to wait for the UI, which can be a pain if you're trying to add all those long animations, but it's just enough that it gives a nice little subtle effect to it to make it feel a little bit better as it's popping in. Now, one thing that I want to do is I want to push this down a little further because that's driving me crazy as I'm looking at it. I just want to shift this down. What I can do is instead of doing full, I want it to be a little bit more than full. Now I can approach that a few different ways. Maybe I can add margin top to it. Maybe that'll help with the click area, but we're not doing hover, so we don't necessarily need that. So what I can just say is calc, I think it's 100% plus, can't type again, plus, let's call it just 1 EM. I think that might work. So let's see what this looks like. That's probably a little bit too much. How about 0.5 EM? And I think that's looking a little bit nicer. It gives it just a little bit of a space in there so that it doesn't look like it's hugging up right next to it. So I think we're in a pretty good spot. We have the menu dynamically opening. We have it transitioning to opening. Now, what else can we do? Now, another just simple thing that we can do is add some icons. Now, somebody should be able to recognize those different names based off the service they want, but having some icons next to it just gives it a little bit an easier way to very quickly look at it and immediately identify what you want to do. Now, there's 100 different icon solutions out there. The one that I've been using is just simpleicons.org. They don't have every single icon for every single brand just because they're trying to follow along with the brand guidelines. It's not all logos permit you to just openly use it. But what we can do is say for Google Calendar, for instance, if this page loads for me, I can search for Google Calendar. And this looks like it's hanging quite a bit. That's not good. Let's try to reopen this page. Simple icons. Let me get rid of that query. Okay. It's loading very slowly for me. So I don't know if this is going to allow us to do this. Might have to use just a backup solution or something. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to let that load. There it goes. Okay. Google Calendar. I don't know if that was my internet or the page, but we can see that we have Google Calendar here really easily to reference. So I'm going to go ahead and click this little copy button. If you click over the icon itself, and then I'm going to head back into the document, and right above Google, I'm going to actually, one thing that I forgot is when you copy this SVG, when you want to paste that into a React or a JSX document, the issue is that some of the properties might not be exactly what you need them to be. If you're familiar with class versus class name, there's some of the other ones that are supposed to be hyphenated, but they need to be camel case, those kind of things. So what we can actually do, that's a nice, really simple trick, is go to this SVG to jsx.com website, which you can easily paste in any of these SVG files, and it's going to immediately convert it to a nice JSX output. So that means it looks like Viewbox probably wouldn't have, no, it looks like it did have the camel case for Viewbox, so it probably would have been fine. But whenever you copy SVG that isn't JSX compatible, this makes it an easy way to convert. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that icon. I'm going to paste it right at the top of Google, and let's just see what this looks like to start. So if I head back in, that's way too big. It's above the text label, which we don't want. So let's clean this up a little bit. So the way that we can easily do this is by using Flexbox instead of displaying block. Now, what we can do with this, we can see by default, it does allow us to have it side by side. We need to make that a little bit bigger, but now I can add class name. Let's say width of 4, height of 4. Let's see if that's appropriate. I think that's looking pretty good, but now I want this to be aligned so that the icon sits about the middle of what Google is. Now what I can do is, because we're using Flexbox, I can say items center. That's looking good. And additionally, I want to add a little bit of space. Now, a lot of times you might be inclined to add some margin to that. And while that certainly works, another nice dynamic way of doing this so that you don't really have to think about whether the icon's on the left or the icon's on the right, you can use Flexbox Gap. So what we're going to add is the gap property. And let's try 2. And now we can see that we have a nice gap. And just to kind of show what I was referring to about the kind of dynamic spacing is if I now move this right on top, we can see that it still has that same gap. But if I had something like margin right on that icon, I would have now had to remove that margin right and now apply margin left on the icon. So this just makes it a little bit easier as you're working in the DOM to really get a good, to really kind of set it to what you want it to be in a easier to use way. But now let's try to get all these icons for the rest of them. Let's see, I have Outlook and Google or Outlook and Yahoo. So I'm going to do Outlook. I think Outlook's here. Looks like it's deprecated, but I think we're still okay to use it for now. Now, this is what I was kind of referring to earlier is the brand guidelines. Now, if you're using this in a production project, you want to make sure that you actually have the rights to use the icon. So make sure you're paying attention to that. That is important. But let's also now add this for our Outlook. Looks like the properties are fine, so we don't have to run that through SVG to JSX. I'm going to add that same class name. And now for Yahoo, Yahoo's actually not in here. If you try to search for it, it doesn't show up in here, and probably because they asked them to take it down. That's the likely reason. But for this one, let's just go ahead and use a generic calendar icon. So I'm going to go to Lucid. My default goes to Lucid React, but Lucid is a nice set of icons that just has a bunch of different options for how we can work with this. So I'm going to search for calendar, and we can see we have a bunch of different options. I think I'm just going to go with the basic first calendar here. We can see we have a lot of options for how we can consume this icon. It even has it has like a React package, but we don't necessarily need that here. I'm just going to simply copy the SVG. Now for this, I do want to paste it in SVG to JSX because I don't think that all these properties are going to align. We can see that in the front here, we have stroke width, we have stroke line cap. And if you notice, these need to be camel case when we're passing them into JSX. So that's why we want to be able to use a tool like this that just makes it a lot easier for us to have to not think about that every time. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this new icon. I'm going to add it into Yahoo. I'm going to get rid of the existing class name and then copy our other SVG class. And I need to add the wrapping ones as well. So that's flex, items, center, and gap 2. And we're in business. So now let's add the rest of the services. We can see that these all work. We also have Office 365. So let's add that as well. Let's see, alphabetically, that would go here. So we have our Office 365 events. And let's add Office 365. Now for this one, they don't have a specific Office 365 icon. So for this one, I just used Microsoft. I think that probably makes sense. Again, it's not showing up. I don't know what's going on with just simply loading these icons, but I'm going to copy that Microsoft SVG icon. And now let's replace the 365 with that one. Where did it go? What just happened? Did I just paste like the entire document in there? I wonder if there must be something going on with simple icons. Here we go. Okay. So let's paste that in. Okay, now we got just that SVG icon. And I'm going to now paste that in for the class name. Let's make sure this looks good. I think that looks pretty good. And then finally, we have ICS. Now, if you're familiar with Apple events or like the Apple calendar, the ICS file is one way that you can add that to your calendar. Now, I don't use Apple Calendar, so this isn't necessarily relevant, but it works a little bit differently from the other ones, where the other ones are text links that we open up in a new tab. Where the ICS, I don't know about the total intricacies of it, but you're ultimately going to be downloading a file. So that what makes it a little bit different and interesting for the perspective of the links that we're generating. But from our purpose and our consumption purposes, we don't really need to think about that difference. All we need to do is then add our ICS link, and let's call this one Apple. And I like to just add the ICS there just in case somebody's using ICS in a different way. Again, I'm not super familiar with that format, but then let's find our Apple icon. If this one ever loads, come on. Let's see if it copies. No, For some reason, that copies the entire document. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Let me try refreshing. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to copy the over that icon and perfect. So now if we can see, let's click this icon. We can see that it downloaded amongst all these other images here from Unsplash. You can see that it downloaded that download.ics file. And again, I don't use Apple Calendar, so it's not really going to work, but we do see that it's going to try to add a new event if I were to set this up, but I'm not going to go ahead and try to set that up. But that's working really well. Now, what's the next step? So one thing that drives me crazy personally is if I have little tooltips like this or modals where I can't click outside of it and close it. I specifically have to open and close it with the button itself. It's just a little UX detail where I want to make sure that my UI is always going to be hidden if they start to interact with something else. Maybe this doesn't always matter, but say you have a navigation menu that blocks most of the page, and then you want to interact with something else, but then it just hangs there and it's blocking like half of the page before you can do anything. So it's preventing you from doing something unless you explicitly go up and click it and close it. So instead, what we can do is if somebody actually clicks outside of this page, let's go ahead and just simply close the dialog. That way they can have a little bit of a nicer experience. So how do we do that? So going back to the code. Now, the way that this is going to work is we're going to first listen for the clicks everywhere on the page. And then we're going to have to think about how we're going to narrow that down. Now, to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import the use effect hook. And let me just check the time, 2:43. I think that's good on time. I can't remember when I started. Somebody can pop in and let me know if we're not good on time. But I'm going to use the use effect hook. And when that spins up, I'm going to say document body, add event listener. Let's call this on click. And then we're going to have our function where we can pass in an argument of events, which is going to get passed into the callback function. And let's just console log this out to see what it looks like. So if you're not familiar with this one, it's just the simple vanilla JavaScript way to add click event listeners. But now we can see that if I start to click somewhere, we get those events inside the browser. Now, let's start with one thing to clean this up. If we noticed, every time we click, we actually get 2 events. Now, the issue, if you're not familiar with React strict mode, is what's going to happen is that use effect is actually going to run twice. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that when it during that mounting process, only in dev mode, that we're going to clean up our event listener so that we don't have to worry about something like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to ultimately return a function here so that we can clean it up in this return statement. Now, to do that, we also need to abstract this function on handle on click, which is going to take in that same event, because we want to make sure that this is referencing the same function when we try to both set up the event listener and when we try to clean it up. So what we're going to do is instead of add event listener, we're going to remove the event listener. Now this event, now that we need to actually type it out, is going to be a mouse event. This for the TypeScript, for those of you who are using TypeScript. But now let's just see, let's console log that out again, just to see if it's working. I think I actually, before I do that, I want to move this outside of the use effect, just so it's not created every single time. But now if we start to click, we can see that we're only getting that one event. So first problem solved. But now if we start to dig into this event object, we have a lot of different information. And the one thing that we're particularly going to be interested in is something like this target here, where we want to see what's actually being clicked. Now, what we want to ultimately do is we want to take what is being clicked, we want to compare it to our add to calendar little widget and make sure that those aren't aligned, so that basically we want to make sure that it's not in that path of going up the parent and making sure that it's not in the area that's being clicked. Now, to do that, we could try to do something crazy like take that target element and check its parent all the way up to the top of the document. Or we can do something a little bit different and we can use what's called its composed path. So let me log this out to show what that looks like. So if I now click outside of the page, we can see that we now have this ability to see all the different elements all the way up to the window. So we can see that that little add to calendar button was never in that path of going through all those elements. But now if I actually, let me hide that, let me click add to calendar, we can see that I do now have that button. I have all those different elements that go up to the window. But what's important is that we have that element inside of that path that we can check if it's there or not. Similarly, if we try to click on, Apple ICS, we can look at this and we can see that that element is going up to the top of the window. So we're going to check and see, is this container inside of this path? And if it is inside of the path, we don't want to do anything. But it's not if it's not inside of the path, we're going to just go ahead and close the little tooltip. So let's come back here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first, I need to create a new reference. Now we need to be able to see if that element is ultimately in there. Now we could do something like query selector so that we can check it, but kind of the React way of being able to reference a DOM element to which in our case, we want to check if it's in that path. What we can do is we can add a ref here. So I'm going to call this button ref. And I know this isn't the button itself. You can probably name this whatever you think is appropriate to make it descriptive for your use case, but ultimately this whole thing is going to be my button. So I'm going to go ahead and use this. So let's now define this by importing use ref. And I'm going to say constant my button ref is equal to use ref. And that is going to be an HTML div elements. And now we need to also say that it could be null because it's going to start off that way. And now we have a ref, and let's see what happens when we add that. So let's go ahead and console log out that button ref. Can't type. It's going to be stored inside of this current property because it's not going to follow the same render lifecycle as something like state. It's going to kind of be like you're having an outside variable, but it's going to be the React way of being able to store this kind of value. So let's just log this out just to see what we're looking at. But once we click somewhere, we can see that we now have that wrapper div element. And now we want to check this button ref to see if it's inside this list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if my events composed path includes my button ref current, then I'm going to say it's inside just to test this out. Else, it's not. Console log, it's not. Okay, but we can see that we get a TypeScript error. Now, we know that's going to be available, but TypeScript doesn't necessarily know that. So what we're going to also say, if the button ref current exists, then we're going to make sure that we check that it's actually inside. So let's now give this a try. Okay, so if I click outside, it's not inside, right? But now if I click the button, it is inside. So it's working perfectly. So now all we need to do is actually just simply close this little dialog element if, based off of that condition. So if it's inside, I want to set is open. If it is inside, actually, I don't want to do anything, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that it's not inside. So we can say if it or for simplicity, since I already have this, let's just say set is open false, because if it's not inside, that means that it's outside of the button area and I want to close it. So let's set is open to false. And now if I head back here, if I click anywhere outside, it's not going to do anything, which makes sense because we don't want it to. We're clicking outside, it's not open. But now if I click to add to calendar and click outside, we can see that it's hidden. Perfect. The thing we also want to check though, is if I click inside, am I still going to be able to interact with it? And we can see that I can. And I can also make sure that I can click these links. I am able to click open the Google template, the Office 360 template, and ultimately I was able to create it so that it's dynamically going to check to make sure that we are clicking where we want to be. Otherwise, it's going to simply dismiss it for us. And I think that's kind of where I'm going to stop with the example. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can take this forward. Maybe just a simple thing like adding color to these icons just to dress it up a little bit nice. Kind of look like that original Learn with JSON example. You can also do things like try out the Popover API. That's a newer browser API that has pretty good availability with all the modern browsers. Maybe that's a better way to open up the actual little menu, but a lot of the stuff will still apply, but it has a little bit more browser capability built right in. But ultimately, I hope this was a fun exercise for you to walk through. I hope you learned something with a little bit of the intricacies of working with React and browser APIs and how to create a nice dynamic calendar that you can drop into your application. So I guess from here, I can open up hello. I guess it can be like Q&A if anybody has any questions.
Welcome back. Thanks for this. That was very insightful. And also, even if it's React, it's very relatable to any other kind of framework. So that's good.
Absolutely.
We have a few questions. W- yes, one that is, can you explain the Popover API further?
Yeah, sure. So the Popover API is a new browser capability that allows you to create similar experiences to the interactive menu that we created. Now, I haven't explored it too much, so that's why I didn't want to use it as this particular example. Plus, I wanted to make sure we were able to do things like the transition to make it have that little bit of a nice touch. So that's why I didn't use it for this particular example. But it's an API that was created specifically to be able to add basically some kind of UI on top of the rest of the element, the rest of the page. Now, there's another API called the dialogue. Well, it's the dialogue
Yeah.
element, which is very similar to the popover API, but they have kind of two different intents. Where the popover API is supposed to be, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's non-modal dialogues as opposed to modal dialogues, which is the dialogue element, the dialogue element's intent. They can both do both things, but it's kind of the intent of what you're trying to do. And some people prefer one over the other. The popover API looks really nice, so I'm excited to dive into a little bit more. But it's great that we have a lot of these options rather than having to install a bunch of different libraries in 2024.
Yeah, especially manage like the dependencies, any issues, etc.
Exactly.
I know that last time I checked, the dialogue API was still kind of in discussion. I'm not sure if they agreed on something, but yeah, that's definitely a good move forward. So that's nice.
Yeah.
Um, is there any kind of performance issues listening to any click at all pages?
Is not listening for any click at all pages kind of bad for performance?
Yeah.
I mean, you certainly want to be careful with your event listeners and making sure that you're not kind of scattering them on all places. I think in this example, it's probably not going to be too intensive. I guess if you add maybe 1,000 of those, you're going to have 1,000 different listeners. One thing that you can do to kind of alleviate that is you can add a state check inside of that use effect so that you only add that event listener if it's open, right? So rather than having it always listen to see if it's open, use effect can run when that state variable sets to true for is open. Then you add that event listener. And then whenever it turns back to false, it'll then clean up and remove that event listener. So that might be a little bit more of a performant way to handle that if it becomes a problem. But one thing to keep in mind, I would try to avoid over optimizing. I think for most applications,
Indeed.
the way that we did it would be fine. But it is something to always keep in mind as you're building applications.
Yeah, like early optimization can be quite toxic. So yeah. And also, yeah, if there's nothing heavy or like network based with an external API call, yeah, that might be good enough.
For sure.
If you have like, I worked on a project where we had a big amount of objects, and that was all reactive, so that was quite heavy.
Could
But yeah,
imagine.
for just like a single click, that's fine. So
Yeah.
what's your go-to source for icons in a React project?
So for a while it was React icons, and I really liked React icons still. Lately I've been using Lucid React. I don't really have a particular reason. I just saw a lot of people were using it. I gave it a try and it's kind of stuck with me. But both Lucid and React icons are fantastic for React projects.
Yeah, my personal one is unplugging icons, which is based on
Mm,
Iconify.
okay,
And yeah, it's very easy to navigate, very precise. A lot of APIs, you can use it in any framework, in HTML, just standalone. It's also very good.
that's awesome.
Um,
One thing that
and
I like about Lucid, which
yeah,
not all icon libraries can speak for, is they seem to have good keywords when you're searching for the icons. Because maybe you don't always know what an icon is specifically called, because sometimes it could be a little funny. Like if you want the X
yeah,
symbol for a close, like it's called times, right? And it makes sense, but you might not be thinking about using the time symbol. So having those nice keywords when you're trying to search is super definitely helpful.
yeah, I agree. Especially when you try to look for pumpkin and like Discord calls it jack o' lantern, and I'm like, what?
Yes, yes, yes.
It's like all of them have like kind of a different name, and I wish that, yeah, we're talking about AI and stuff. I wish that like if I put potato or like something else, that it could guess like quiche or something, But
Right.
yeah,
I
no, it
feel like
doesn't
we have
work.
the technology today to have
Yeah,
that kind of matching, right?
AI is not there yet,
No, I
soon
guess not.
maybe. What would this? I mean, would you have like a solution to make it work on the server side?
Sure. So the the event listeners that we were adding certainly would need to be inside of a client component. But what you can do is you can bundle that up inside its own component, just the button itself. You would add the use client directive at the top. And then from there, you can drop in that component to any server page that you want, and it can work perfectly fine. So because we're doing the on-click handlers and actually working with the DOM, you would need to make sure that you expose it in some way as a client component.
Yeah, to expand on this, Colby is basically confirming that you don't have magic sauce here, because sometimes you can just make some solution isomorphic, so that way it works on the server and on the client. In this situation, there's nothing like that. So usually you just slap the gaff tape of client only, and then yeah, you move forward. We have a new one, which is a bit unrelated, but probably just asking for your knowledge, Colby. Do you have any particular newsletters or blogs that you follow?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Twitter is probably the one that I look to most. But as much as I don't like Twitter, there are a lot of really intelligent people sharing a lot of interesting things. So I do try to keep my eyes there. I know Cooper Press has a lot of good newsletters that they do, whether it's React or just JavaScript general. A gentleman named Sebastian, I'm blanking on his last name, has a really good React newsletter that doesn't go just into React, but it goes into Next.js and even React Native. So those are a good couple of options. But yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think Twitter is a bad platform?
Just the politics side of it, and some people can be less hospitable in the community, and it.
Yeah.
But as long as you're following the right people, positive, smart people, that's
that's why I recommend using a list where you just put like 50, 60 people in there, and you just follow the list. Because otherwise, if you open the evil gates of the homepage of Twitter, it can be a bit messy.
For sure.
Also, I think that like following some nice people on YouTube, like your YouTube channel or a lot of other content creators, is a very good way. You like, even if you have like some YouTube Premium or something, you can even watch it without being spammed with all the ads on Twitter. So that's even better. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources for us right now.
Yeah. So thanks again, Colby.
It was my pleasure.
As expected. And
Thank you.
I wish you an amazing day.
Thanks, you as well. Have a good weekend, everybody.